Okay, hi everybody, good morning. I think we'll make a start, if that's okay. Hopefully you can all see the screen that is being shared. So hi, good morning and welcome to this online launch event to launch Greater Manchester Poverty Action's latest report, Coping with an Impossible Situation, how organisations and individuals are struggling to respond to the fuel poverty crisis. My name is Laura Burgess and I am Senior Policy and Research Advisor here at GMPA. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we begin, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Greater Manchester Poverty Action, I'll just give you a little bit of background on who we are. Greater Manchester Poverty Action is a not-for-profit organisation that works to prevent and reduce poverty across Greater Manchester. Our vision is of a Greater Manchester free from poverty, where all residents can realise their potential and access the benefits of living in a diverse and vibrant city region. We as an organisation are experts in poverty across Greater Manchester, and we work with stakeholders to implement strategic responses to poverty, and we are passionate about ensuring the voices of those with lived experience of poverty are heard in decision making. Next slide, please. So today's session, firstly, it's me welcoming everybody. So again, thanks to you all for joining us. We will then hear from Anna Lopez, Policy and Research Assistant at GMPA. Anna is the lead author of this report and she will present the research findings to us. Next, we're very glad that Maya Fitchett from National Energy Action has come to speak to us today about the national picture regarding fuel poverty. I will then discuss where we think the conversation should go from here, and I'll share some of the recommendations that have emerged from this piece of research to local and central government. Finally, we'll do some work where hopefully yourselves, part of our webinar today, can share best practice on what you and your organisations might be doing to support people with who are experiencing fuel poverty, and any other solutions that we think might be viable to fuel poverty across Greater Manchester and beyond. So please do have that in mind. The webinar is being recorded, so if anyone does want to speak in the group session part of the webinar, if you raise your hand with the button at the bottom of the screen, we'll be able to unmute you and you can speak. Your video won't come on, but you can speak, and that will be part of the recording, so just to make people aware of that. And then hopefully at the end we will have a chance for some Q&As. So if you do have any questions for any of the panel, please pop it in the Q&A box, and one of the team at GMPA are going to be monitoring that and putting it to the panel at the end. So thanks again for joining us. I'm now going to pass over to Anna Lopez to present the research findings to us. And so yeah, the floor is yours, Anna. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you everyone for coming. As Laura said, I'm a research and policy assistant at Greater Manchester Poverty Action, and I conducted a lot of the research for this report. So I will walk you through some of the findings. Next slide, please. So as an outline, I'm just going to cover a quick summary of the project and go over the methodology before covering the research findings in 3 sections: responding to rising costs, capacity among local organisations, and impacts of fuel poverty. Next slide, please. So the project came out of 2 key questions. Firstly, what impacts are rising fuel costs having on people on low incomes across Greater Manchester and the organisations that work to support them? And secondly, what could local and national government do to address this? The research was funded by the Warm This Winter Coalition, which is a coalition of over 40 leading UK charities who are working to prevent fuel poverty in the short term by encouraging the government to address this directly, and prevent it in the longer term by transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy, and upgrading homes to reduce energy usage. We'll mention them again at the end of the webinar, but if you'd like to find out more, please Google Warm This Winter, or there's a link at the beginning of our report. Next slide, please. So the report is divided into 2 areas: what impacts are rising energy prices having in Greater Manchester, which I'll address now, and what should be done to address fuel poverty, which Laura will address later in the webinar. Next slide, please. So the research for this project was conducted between November and January of the last year. The research included a focus group, which was conducted with people with lived experience of poverty from across Greater Manchester. And they offered their insight on the impacts of fuel poverty and responses to it, as well as the availability of support, barriers accessing that support, and they also offered their insight into what this report should focus on and what should be the key priorities. We also used a survey to gather some of the research for this, and that survey was distributed through GMPA's network to people working within organisations that support people living on low incomes. And we asked our respondents to talk about to answer questions about demand for their services, the capacity within their organisations, and also to offer recommendations for local and national government. Next slide, please. So in responding to rising costs, we attempted to discover what proportion of our survey respondents believe the majority of the people they serve to be doing the following things: reducing heating to below government recommended levels, relying on advice and support to adequately heat their homes, borrowing money, and using warm spaces. As you can see, the majority of our respondents felt that more than half their clients were reducing heating and relying on advice and support. This tallies with the focus group findings, which highlighted that many of the focus group respondents were being forced to cut heating below government levels. As you can also see, less than half thought that the majority of their clients were borrowing money, and only 30% felt they were using warm spaces. This also actually tallies with our focus group findings, in which only one participant highlighted using warm spaces to stay warm. Others raised issues such as kind of staying warm at night, which warm spaces weren't able to address, and highlighted that the experience of being constantly cold sapped energy and made it much harder to access warm spaces in the first place. Next slide, please. We also wanted to ask our survey respondents about the capacity among their organisations to support people. 88%, as you can see, said that the demand for support had increased significantly in contrast to the same time last year, with another 10% saying it had increased slightly. Crucially, no respondents felt the demand had decreased from the same time last year. Next slide, please. We also asked respondents whether they received requests for support that their organisations were unable to meet due to a lack of capacity or resources. As you can see, 77% said this was the case, and only 23% felt they were able to meet all the requests for support they received. Next slide, please. This proportion increased further when we excluded housing providers, and issues of lack of capacity were particularly acute among charities, community groups, and faith groups. Of respondents working in these organisations, only 4 out of the 35 included in our survey said that their organisation always had the capacity to meet demands for support. Next slide, please. Among those who said they weren't always able to meet demand for support, only 9% said they were able successfully to refer clients to other providers with the capacity to support them. 47% said they were sometimes able to do this, and 10% said that they were only occasionally or not at all able to refer clients. This highlights both that there's significant problems in Greater Manchester within the VCSE sector of demand exceeding supply, and also suggests that there's a real risk that people in need of support are being bounced between organisations as capacity runs dry, which focus group respondents highlighted as a particular barrier to accessing support. Next slide, please. We also asked focus group participants about some of the impacts of fuel poverty. And one thing that came through very clearly is that focus group participants very much spoke of impacts on family and on community. Fuel poverty didn't seem to be seen as a very isolated experience, but it says something that was affecting a lot of people at the moment. Of the impacts, they can be roughly divided into 3 impacts: on daily life, on physical health, and on mental health. Of physical health, one of the key things that came through was how much fuel poverty and the experience of being cold, and many of the accommodations required to stay warm, so kind of wearing many layers, staying in bed, really sapped participants' energy and made it much harder to do other things. There was also a real sense that being cold also disrupted sleep quite significantly. And finally, that the rising bills made it very, very difficult for people to have the spare money that might be needed to take children on trips or to celebrate holidays in the way they'd like. In that sense, fuel poverty extended far beyond just being cold, but had really significant impacts on everyday life. Next slide, please. Secondly, we focus on physical health. I'll just give you a second to read the quote that's on the screen. As you can see, some of the health impacts or health risks associated with fuel poverty can be really significant. Alongside these examples of really concerning kind of situations when people can't afford to heat homes despite significant health problems, there was also a general sense that fuel poverty kind of really increased everyday health conditions or everyday health experiences such as headaches or physical tension. A lot of participants spoke particularly of always feeling very physically tense in the shoulders, for example. Next slide, please. And finally, almost all participants spoke of pervasive stress and worry as a result of fuel poverty. Many of the accommodations required to cope with fuel poverty themselves had really detrimental impacts. One participant spoke of covering their windows with bubble wrap to keep the house warmer, but also described it as horrible and making the house feel like they lived in a mental institution. Here, I think it's really important to point out that many of the accommodations required by fuel poverty end up creating a physical environment that's really unhelpful for mental health. And finally, many of the participants spoke about increasing rates of suicide in their communities. This was particularly that many participants knew of family or friends who had lost loved ones to suicide recently. It's incredibly hard to find data that would speak to these observations, but I think it is really important to highlight that fuel poverty, the health impacts of fuel poverty extends far beyond the effects of the cold. Next slide, please. So finally, to summarise the key findings of the report, fuel poverty appears to be rising across the city region, and demand for support has increased significantly since the same period of time last year. As a result of this, organisations that provide support to people on low incomes in Greater Manchester are unable to meet the demand for support, with the majority surveyed being forced to turn people away due to a lack of capacity or resources. And finally, fuel poverty is negatively impacting on the daily lives and health of people living on low incomes in Greater Manchester. Thanks very much for listening. I'd now like to turn over to Maya, who's going to fill us in on the national picture of fuel poverty.
Thanks, Anna, and a huge thanks to Greater Manchester Poverty Action for inviting me to speak today. My name's Maya Fitchett. I'm a policy analyst at National Energy Action, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what fuel poverty looks like on a national scale. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So, who are NEA? So we are the UK's leading expert fuel poverty charity, and our main aim is to help low-income, fuel-poor and vulnerable families secure access to affordable heat. We're both an advocacy and an advisory service. So we have an operational side who work on the front line. They provide advice and support as well as accredited training and qualifications. And then we have an advocacy directorate, which I work in, and we campaign to ensure that fuel poor households are at the centre of policy decisions. We also undertake research to better understand the environment surrounding fuel poverty. Within that, I lead particularly on a fair and affordable transition to net zero and how that can alleviate fuel poverty. So a big focus is, sorry, previous slide still. Thank you. So a big focus is looking at where fuel poverty intersects with green solutions, so campaigning for better investment into energy efficiency. We were founded by volunteers in 1981 as Neighbourhood Energy Action, and we've since scaled up, so we now work nationally. And that's the lens that I'll be looking at fuel poverty through today. So we cover England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and our sister organisation, Energy Action Scotland, covers Scotland. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So given that the Warm This Winter report focuses on the rising levels of fuel poverty in Greater Manchester, I wanted to complement that by talking about fuel poverty from a more national perspective. So I'll also be talking a little bit about what we can do to reform the energy market so that it works in a way that's fair and equal and affordable. And I'll be talking to you specifically about our investigative report that looks at the different ways that fuel poverty has played out and deepened over the past 2 years. It also highlights those who have been the hardest hit and what needs to be done to protect them. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So I was going to run through some definitions and metrics of fuel poverty, but for the sake of time, I won't. So I'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what does fuel poverty look like in the UK? So I think it'll be no surprise to anyone that the cost of living has gone up. The cost of heating the average home with gas has doubled in the past 18 months, and we now have approximately 6.7 million UK households in fuel poverty. This is actually due to rise to 7.5 million households in April, so Saturday, when the energy bill support scheme ends. Measuring fuel poverty is difficult, so my last slide would have gone over how different UK nations use different metrics, but it's not a uniform picture, and I thought it was really important to demonstrate that. So please just note that these aren't directly comparable, but they can give you a bit of an overview of what the official picture looks like across the UK, and we have a stats explainer on our website if you wanted to look into that a little bit more. So we're looking at levels of 13.4% of households in the UK in fuel poverty, and that's predicted to rise to 14.4% this year, 40% of Scotland, and a shocking 45% of Northern Ireland and Wales. The typical household is looking to be around £67 a month worse off from April the 1st, but important to note that that's the typical household, and lots of households will be worse off than that. So particularly those without reliable access to support or using different heating systems, for example, Gypsy Roma traveller communities who live on sites or off gas grid homes. And also important to note that bills are still 2 times what they were 6 months ago, and most people couldn't afford them then. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So in order to talk about fuel poverty in the UK, I'll be drawing lots on our most recent fuel poverty monitor, which was published in January. We've been publishing annual investigative reports for 20 years, which evaluate the progress made to eliminate fuel poverty across the UK. So the one that I'll be talking to you about today focuses on the impacts of soaring energy prices on UK households and what the different responses to this have been. So I'm going to talk you through some of the key findings. I think these provide a really good overview of what fuel poverty looks like across the UK and where we need to focus attention. And then at the end, I'll come back to some policy recommendations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this just talks about the factors behind the cost of living crisis. So gas prices are the factor that most people are familiar with. I won't spend too much time going through these for the sake of time, but these have also been exacerbated by the cost of failed energy suppliers and the UK's housing stock. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first key finding I wanted to pull out from the fuel poverty monitor is that the lowest income households living in the least efficient homes are being particularly hard hit. This is because of the relationship between energy efficiency and fuel poverty. So there's a significant overlap between those living in the lowest incomes and those in the least efficient homes. And we have some households paying a premium in the thousands in order to keep warm. The effects of this are particularly salient in Scotland and Wales, as we just saw, which are home to some of the UK's poorest housing stock. And the overlap means that households on the lowest incomes, i.e. those with the least room to facilitate higher bills, are feeling the impacts of price rises much more deeply. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the second point I wanted to pull out is that households falling into multiple intersecting categories of vulnerability are being disproportionately affected. Obviously, income has a big impact, as we've just spoken about. Susceptibility to rising prices is a big factor, but those in some of the most strained positions sit within overlapping categories of vulnerability. Those households can sit outside the traditional routes of identification, and as a result, they're particularly vulnerable as they're less likely to receive the support they need. A key example of this would be low-income households who have members with a medical condition which necessitates a higher minimum energy use. For example, households who need to keep warmer as a result of a mobility issue or a respiratory issue. These households often also require different support, particularly when it comes to advice around reducing energy demand. It can be dangerous for these households to follow some of the energy demand reduction advice provided to less vulnerable households, for example, turning the thermostat down by 1 degree or using other sort of similar coping strategies. And just run through some of those categories quickly. So we've got financially vulnerable groups. So those are households who have a limited capacity to respond to financial shocks. It could be that they have persistently low household income, or it could be that they've experienced a life event which has decreased household income, for example, a redundancy or a broken boiler. We have health-based vulnerabilities. So as Anna just touched on, the health impacts of the energy crises are deep and far-reaching. These households could be those who are reliant on energy-intensive medical equipment or households with disabilities. We then have household characteristic-based vulnerabilities. So it could be things like household composition, for example, a single parent household, or it could be tenure. For example, we know that households in the private rental sector see the highest numbers of fuel poverty. Over a quarter of those households are in fuel poverty. And this is due to lack of autonomy over heating systems, higher prevalence of low incomes, as well as rising rents and precarity in the sector. We've then got energy efficiency and dwelling characteristics. So as we've already touched on, households in the least efficient homes, but also users of unregulated heating fuels. These consumers can often see huge price fluctuation with little to no protection. And then we have market vulnerabilities. So when households are either unable to represent their interests or they're likely to suffer detriment through engaging with energy markets. So this could be digitally excluded households or households with accessibility needs. And then finally, geographical vulnerabilities. So this refers to the differing levels of support available across UK nations, but could also relate to houses in colder locations or more remote or rural areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So prepay meter households are facing some of the biggest challenges accessing support and are actually at acute risk due to self-disconnection. So these households have to top up before accessing energy. So whilst lots of households will face pressures when when paying bills, and they may have to ration usage or accrue debt, low-income households on prepay can lose access to energy entirely by so-called self-disconnecting, i.e. when they can't afford to put any money on the meter, so they're left without any access at all. Legacy prepayment meters, so there's the traditional meters, i.e. not smart meters, they present some of the most challenges around the ability to access support. You have to go and physically top up with these meters at a shop, which is a huge barrier, and until recently even saw higher energy costs than direct debit customers. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. Whilst the scale of national support is unprecedented, as Anna mentioned, we need deeper and much more targeted support. And so far, the vital resources have been pretty poorly targeted. So we've seen blanket measures rolled out as an emergency response. And unfortunately, not only has this been inefficient and expensive, it's also seen lots of households who need support falling through the cracks. The budget's plugged some of those gaps, but there's still a massive need for more. And also important to note that the income support that is available has been stretched across energy bills, food, rents, and all the other consumables that are rising in price. Next slide, please. So who has stepped in the place of central support? Voluntary and charity organisations have, but we face huge capacity challenges. And despite our efforts and those of many local and national organisations, the cases that we're dealing with are growing in number and complexity. The crisis is deepening. Households are now dealing with a build-up of various intersecting issues, and so support needs to not only come from this sector, but from actors across the sector, whether that's energy suppliers, energy networks, landlords, Ofgem. These actors can't impact the price of energy, but what they can do is provide better advice, better signpost support, and better identify those in vulnerable positions. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? So I'm going to set out 3 policy recommendations here. So a fair and affordable transition to net zero, prepayment meter market reforms, and a social tariff. Next slide, please. So we need a fair, affordable transition to net zero in order to mitigate this crisis and to avoid future crises. A huge factor in how acutely this crisis has been felt is how leaky homes in the UK are, and our reliance on fossil fuels for heating. And so clearly a big part of the solution lies in decarbonisation, whether that's reducing energy demand through better insulating houses, or whether that's transitioning to low and no carbon heat, or ideally both. And NEA estimate that decarbonising fuel poor homes could generate savings of £2 billion per year for households. So we really need to see extra energy efficiency support. We need to see adequate funding available to support fuel poor households. In the UK, an example of that might be increasing energy company obligation plus funding targets to £3 billion over 3 years. So that's one of the key schemes supporting energy efficiency for low-income households. In Wales, this might look like ensuring the latest iteration of the Warm Homes programme is suitably resourced. We need to see household contributions banned for schemes aimed at low-income households. We know this blocks access for fuel poor and vulnerable families. And we also need to see any additional costs, so any ancillary or upfront costs removed for these groups. And finally, we need to see better advice provision. In order to ensure that fuel poor households aren't paying disproportionately for the transition to net zero, these households need to be prioritised, and if they're not, they will end up paying for it. And this is because, as we know, low-income households spend a high proportion of their income on fuel, and as a result, they're much more sensitive to see which make it more expensive to use fossil fuels. So, for example, placing green levies on bills is going to be a huge detriment to fuel poor households. So costs really need to be recuperated in a progressive way. Next slide, please. So we need to provide specific support to prepay households so that self-disconnections can be minimised. So we need to see no prepayment meters installed in vulnerable households. And whilst we support the temporary halting of installations in light of the scandal that's emerged around forced installations, we really need a longer term ban on installations in medically vulnerable households. We need to see suppliers, A, committing to provide clarity on how many warrants they'd sought, and then B, setting out plans to compensate affected customers. The UK government needs to assess whether the current process of issuing warrants to install prepayment meters is suitable, whether it considers the vulnerability of households, and whether this is a fair and reasonable way to recover debt. Overall, we need a root and branch review of this system. We need to see no new legacy prepayment meters. So despite the issues, there are a minority of households who prefer to be on prepay, whether that's to help them budget or due to accessibility issues, but any installations must be smart meters. We need to address the price structure of energy for prepayment customers. So we welcome the recent scrapping of the unfair premium paid by these customers, but this still needs to be applied to the 5.5 million households on standard credit. And then we need to address the debt burden for customers. So the Treasury should be providing financial support to clear the debt of customers who are vulnerable to self-disconnection. And then finally, next slide, please. And then finally, I'll be talking about social tariffs. So what this does essentially is it provides targeted support for those who need it most in the form of a discounted energy tariff, and that sits below the cheapest available tariff. What this would do is ensure that those most affected by the crisis are the priority for future support. It sets out a long-term energy market framework that understands energy as an essential good as opposed to a commodity, and it also acts as a safety net for households who are struggling to afford bills. So this must be a few things. This must be mandated across all suppliers to make sure that no one loses out. It must be targeted at those who are currently disadvantaged by the market. It must use data to auto-enroll customers, and it must be additional to energy efficiency support for low-income households. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I know I've whizzed through a massive amount of information there. I just wanted to round off by providing you with our website so that you can have a deeper look into any of the topics I've discussed today. I think there's going to be a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, but my email is there if you'd like to get in touch. And massive thank you for listening.
Thanks, Maya. Next slide, please. Thank you. So thanks so much to Anna for presenting the research findings of this report, and to Maya for sharing the overall national picture of fuel poverty. It was really interesting. So thank you. It's really clear that the situation with fuel poverty is at crisis point, and there needs to be meaningful action at every layer of government to help lift households out of this unbearable situation. I'm going to speak now for a few minutes on what our findings suggest need to be done by local and national government to support households who are struggling to pay bills, but also to support voluntary organisations that are already working so hard in this field. Next slide, please. So what do the findings show? Throughout the focus group that Anna spoke about and the survey, feelings were raised about the current approach to supporting people with high energy bills and what more could be done. Overwhelmingly, it was felt that the support currently being offered was across the board was insufficient. Among survey respondents, more than 3/4 felt that the support being offered was not enough, and the prevailing feeling among focus group participants was that current support failed to alleviate the physical and mental costs of fuel poverty. So our report highlights a number of key priority areas that need attention in order to help people experiencing fuel poverty. And it's important to highlight that these areas were identified through our primary research and reflect the priorities of people with lived experience of fuel poverty and those working to support in the BCSE sector. The priorities were split across two categories, priorities for local government and priorities for national government, although, as you may expect, there was some significant overlap of each. Next slide, please. So I'll firstly discuss the overall priorities that can be reasonably applied to local and national government. Both survey respondents and focus group participants identified the need to provide direct financial support to low-income households. It was highlighted that individuals are finding it increasingly difficult to meet costs, particularly as costs continue to rise whilst in receipt of welfare payments, and also that means testing of welfare payments often results in people who are really struggling are excluded from receiving welfare support because they don't meet the criteria. An increase in state benefits was the main suggestion of how people can be supported financially. And in terms of financial support, GMPA, along with many of our partner organisations, advocate for a cash-first approach. We believe offering cash grants as local welfare support instead of vouchers, food aid or other types of in-kind support maximises an individual's choice, dignity and control. Cash grants remove the stigma of receiving types of in-kind support, and most households who are experiencing fuel poverty, along with all types of poverty, do so primarily because of a fundamental lack of money. Next, clear signposting to what support is already on offer was a priority for many respondents. The focus group told us that they were often confused by what support was available, and all agreed that a one-stop shop type facility in communities would be best to access support. Finally, in our recommendations that apply across the board was free or subsidised improvements to housing. Excuse me. Suggestions to the types of improvements that would help people with energy bills were measures such as retrofitting of insulation, reflecting that much of Greater Manchester's housing stock is poor quality, old, cold and damp. Next slide, please. So turning now to our recommendations for local government, as previously mentioned, the priority was the need for direct financial support for households. Some survey respondents also flagged the need for council coordination of the BCSE sector. Concerns were raised over the potential duplication of some services in some areas and widespread unmet need in other areas. Council coordination goes hand in hand with the suggestion by residents for better signposting of services, and recommendations were made from the focus group for local government across Greater Manchester to compile a list or a comprehensive booklet of all services available. It is just worth mentioning here that Greater Manchester Poverty Action have produced a money advice referral tool in 6 out of 10 boroughs in Greater Manchester so far. The boroughs are Bury, Manchester, Oldham, Tameside, Trafford and Wigan. I hope I've got those correct. The marts, as we refer to them, are designed to be used by frontline organisations helping people deal with poverty. The marts contain information specific to each borough about what support is available, and they assist with referrals to other organisations that might be able to help. If you would like any more information about the MAR, if you think it might be useful in your work, please do get in contact with one of us here at GMPA. So in addition to better coordination and signposting, focus group respondents also spoke of simple yet effective solutions like using community spaces, doctor surgeries, supermarkets, schools, libraries and such to display information about support that they can access in their local area, and for councils to place debt advisors in warm spaces to support people when they're there. Finally, in terms of what local authorities can do, there was a clear recognition from all who took part in this research that local government cannot tackle fuel poverty alone. Respondents advocating the lobbying of central government by councils, and a particular theme identified was the need for the reversal of the £20 cut to universal credit. Next slide, please. Now turning finally to our recommendations for national government. Again, the key priority was running through our research was the need for financial support to individuals and households, which I've covered previously. In addition to the direct financial support, further capping on energy prices was highlighted as a measure that would provide much needed relief for those struggling with bills. It's important to note here that much of this data was gathered earlier this year prior to the announcement by the Chancellor in the spring budget that the energy price cap would be extended for 3 months. But there are still some concerns among many that energy prices will remain astronomical next winter. And I think Maya alluded to that about how energy bills are still on the rise. Other suggestions included the responsibility of government to source additional energy. So thanks again to Maya for giving us some really good insight into that. Another theme that came through strongly from all survey respondents and focus group participants was that all cost of living responses, whether it's fuel poverty or other types of responses, and longer term strategies aimed at tackling poverty must address the loneliness and isolation it causes. Proposed solutions to these were rooted in the creation of community spaces, which would need to be centrally funded. Thanks for listening. I'm now going to pass over to Penny Rimmer, GMPA's Policy Officer, who's going to facilitate a bit of a group discussion and hopefully some questions. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks, Laura. So we now have some time for a group discussion. I'm just keeping an eye on the time just to discuss 2 key points. So I'll just put them in the group chat for people to see clearly. But as Laura mentioned at the start, if you would like to take part, please raise your hands and I will enable the microphone feature. So the first point is, do you have any examples of action that your organisation or an organisation you are aware of is doing to mitigate and prevent fuel poverty? It would be great to hear some examples of kind of best practice that's going on out there at the moment. Just give everyone a few minutes. So I think, Dan, I think you were going to mention some of the work that we have been doing at GMPA about the importance of lived experience engagement. So it would be great to hear more about that, Dan, if you could enable your microphone. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny.
Thanks.
Yeah, please do, if anybody else wants to contribute as well, please do let us know. I think from our perspective at GMPA, one of the key things we do in our programme delivery is focused on getting the input of people with lived experience. And I know that's been touched on a couple of times today in terms of the survey and the focus group feedback for this work. But it has been massively vital in the areas where we've seen it, you know, whether that is boroughs doing Poverty Truth Commissions, Trafford have just finished theirs, we led the Tameside one last year. You know, you really do see the value of those kind of programmes in terms of getting the views of people with lived experience. Seeing some people from Tameside are on the call today. And, you know, as examples, you know, poverty awareness training being developed for frontline staff in Tameside with input from input from lived experience of poverty. It really does make that massive difference. And it can do, again, for this topic itself, in terms of, you know, reaching out, listening to communities, as has been touched on in the discussion so far, you know, listening to what are the biggest impacts of fuel poverty. You know, what are those issues to do with prepayment meters, rising costs, the premium we've seen, the poverty premium for utility bills. You know, it's those bits of feedback that have helped to influence change. and that bit can't be understated, is how valuable it is in terms of the wider picture. So yeah, we've massively seen the value of it.
Thank you, Dan. And we've got someone who's got their hand raised, so I'll just allow them to talk. So I think it's GMPA. So I've enabled the microphone feature. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Just two things. So our experience, we did a lot of this, and the mayor facilitated our meetings with Ofgem and the energy companies. One thing that was noted there is, while we told them before Christmas about the problem of forced fitting of prepayment meters, it wasn't until the Times exposed it and the whole country was outraged they did anything. So there's a problem with both the regulator and the companies and government simply not taking action until forced by public pressure. And then the second thing is kind of a technical thing, is have we looked at sort of community level generation of energy, and also in efficiency, could that also include fitting of solar panels or neighborhood wind generation projects, which do remove some of the costs that you get because of lost energy from the transmission line length from generation to location of use?
That's great, yeah, and especially about the forced prepayment meters, which is just a national scandal, and you're rightly so. You know, until that pressure's put on, it does make a difference when there's a lot of pressure. Thank you very much. So next we have Stephanie, and if you would just tell us which organisation you're from as well, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, thank you.
Yeah, so I work for a housing association in Salford, which is for housing. So what we're currently doing at the minute is there's a few initiatives. Obviously, we recognise the impacts of the cost of living on our tenants. So we've actually invested in increasing our frontline staff to provide more tenancy support. So we're getting out there supporting more tenants. So this will happen in the next few months. We've also allocated what's called a Live Well fund. So as a tenancy support officer, I can go out to tenants, and if I can see that they're experiencing fuel poverty, I can actually issue cash or vouchers to them to assist them through this difficult period. We're also very big, I know that we mentioned about looking at more sustainable energy use. So we are really looking at changing our homes to be more green, looking at solar panels and other ways to heat homes as well. So that's what we're currently doing at the moment.
Oh, that's great to hear, Stephanie, and you're especially right. It's about maximising resources for people, because at this time it's very difficult with the
Yeah. Well, we're just a team of 3 at the minute, so they've actually invested for us to actually have another 4 members of staff, because it's seen that the demand is there, that people are needing support. And obviously from the slides, from what Anna said about the impact on physical and mental health is massive at the moment as well. So it's not just dealing with the fuel poverty.
Absolutely, and fuel poverty, it's cross-cutted. It goes to housing, health,
Yeah.
all different types of areas. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you. And next we've got Claire. So Claire, if you could tell us which organisation you're from, thank you very much.
Hi there, I'm Claire Bieber. I'm from the Trafford Poverty Truth Commission, which recently completed the commission, and we produced a report. It's quite kind of reassuring, really, that a lot of what you've said today really chimes with the recommendations that our community and civic commissioners in Trafford put together, particularly around access to information and the real desire that there is for that kind of ease to be able to just get straight to the information you need without having to kind of go via multiple re-referrals from service to service. So in terms of what we're doing at the moment in Trafford, off the back of the Poverty Truth Commission, we've been funded to continue to engage with the residents with lived experience of poverty who participated in the commission. And we're hoping to set up a panel of with our commissioners and with additional residents as well, to kind of take the recommendations forward, particularly around embedding that voice of lived experience, as Dan was talking about, which is really important, but also hoping to work with the council and other partners to improve access to information and services and create that one-stop shop. So any kind of work we can do with GMPA and with other partners across Greater Manchester to kind of inform that and make it as, as effective as possible, we'd be very pleased to kind of continue to engage with everyone on that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That resident engagement is absolutely necessary to ensure that actually locally tailored responses to fuel poverty are making that difference. And at GMPA, we will be happy to follow that work up. That's really positive. Thank you very much. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So we've got about 2 minutes left. So I'll just take one last attendee. So Daphne, if you'd like to tell us which organisation you're from, thank you very much.
Me.
Thank you.
Hi, so I work at Citizens Advice Manchester. I'm the Energy Services Manager. So in terms of what we're doing, we are currently delivering an energy project funded by Cadence, the gas network. And basically we deliver energy advice and we can issue fuel vouchers, food bank vouchers, which you can imagine is basically on a daily basis. And I think we played quite a big part with gathering as many evidence forms for the research and campaign on prepayment meters. And although the Times did take all the credit for that, apparently, for uncovering it, but we have been working on that for a long time. Another thing that we managed to do, so we were given part of the household support fund from the council, and we were able then to support 450 families with cash vouchers, basically, about £400 per family. So I'd like to think that that's gone towards, obviously, fuel cost and cost of living in general. So there are a number of things that we can do, but it doesn't seem like we do enough anyway, because we do tend to have repeat customers. The fuel voucher won't fix the issue. They will keep coming back, and unfortunately there's only a limited amount of vouchers we can issue, so it's a much wider issue, but we do what we can.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Thank you, Daphne. Yeah, you're especially right. We need that national government intervention, because the household support fund and other fundings like that are only short term. What we need is really sustained action. So thank you very much. So next we'll be going on to a quick Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes left. So next slide, please, Aisha. Thank you. Okay, so I've just got a couple of questions, I think, in the Q&A box. So I think I'll go to Maya first, if that's okay. So the first question we've got are there any studies that are comparing the UK picture against our neighbours in Europe? So what's the impact of Brexit, uncapped profits of energy suppliers? Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, sure. So I just responded by saying there's some analysis by the IMF, which points out the unequal cost burden between rich and poor households in the UK, particularly relative to other households within other countries in Europe. They also point out our reliance on gas, which is a lot heavier than some other countries in Europe, and the quality of our housing stock. So something that I think a few of us have mentioned today. I'm not sure about any other research, but I can have a dig, and yeah, happy to send around if that's useful for people.
Oh, thank you so much, Maya. That's really good to hear, and it will be great to share those studies. And just another question, really. So if you could elaborate on what National Energy Action is doing to support net zero, any work that you're currently doing?
Sure. So that's sort of the area that I sit on, is a fair and affordable transition to net zero. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that work is focused on ensuring that the transition is fair and affordable. So there's a lot of research, particularly a piece by Creds, which I'll send in the chat in a minute, which points out that if we just continue with the route to net zero as it currently is, it's going to result in these distributional outcomes that unfairly sort of penalise or place the burden on low-income households. Because, as I mentioned earlier, these households have they're spending a lot more of their income on energy, and so when policy costs are recovered through placing levies on gas or placing levies on fossil fuels, it's low-income households that will lose out. So it's really about sort of ensuring that the benefits of net zero are accessible for all homes. This also includes things like ensuring that the energy efficiency schemes aimed at low-income households are available too. So another thing that I mentioned are the cost barriers, the financial barriers that stand in the way of low-income and fuel-poor households accessing energy efficiency. So that's why we need to see any upfront costs removed. We need to have any household contributions banned to ensure that it really is possible for everyone, regardless of your sort of household income or fuel poverty status, to access energy efficiency schemes.
Absolutely, that's so right. It should be fair across the board, and that's something that really needs to be worked on by the government at the moment. So thank you very much, Maya. So I think we've just got one question left for Anna and Laura. So I'd just be interested if you could elaborate on the focus group findings. So what were people's experiences of energy support at kind of a local level? Anna, thank you.
Yeah, so I think one thing that came through, and Laura's already touched on this, is that there was a lot of confusion around what schemes people were eligible for and what schemes were being offered at all. And that was something that kind of clearly was quite a significant barrier to accessing support, because people, I think one participant spoke of assuming that council support wasn't eligible, they weren't eligible for council support because they weren't in a council home, for example, and there being a real need to make kind of government provider support much clearer. A lot of participants also suggested kind of other routes to publicising support. So one-stop shop was the kind of clearest thing that came through from a lot of the focus group participants, but there was also suggestions about sending letters to households, for example, or advertising through the radio at supermarkets to try and make sure that support was much more clearly advertised, because it wasn't really, people weren't often aware of what support there was, or certainly not the extent of the support available, and sometimes felt that the support that was available was targeted at specific populations, for example, older people, despite the fact that everyone is struggling with the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that, Laura.
Yeah, you've covered it really well there, Anna. Thanks. I think just another thing that came through, building on what you said about, you know, the access to community spaces. I think there was much confusion sort of across different localities in Greater Manchester as to where people could go to get support. And there was a recognition that often a lot of support is online, and sometimes people are excluded digitally, from accessing support online. So it was really important that, you know, sort of traditional methods of communication like leaflets and that type of thing in community spaces was really crucial, in addition to what's available on the internet. So that's just to round that up. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks, Anna, Laura and Maya, for those questions. So we'll now move on to the next slide, and Anna will be talking a little bit about the Warm This Winter mass lobby. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. I just wanted to cut in quickly and highlight that Warm This Winter, the funders of this research, are holding a mass lobby on Saturday. They're asking everybody to lobby their MPs to pledge to keep their constituents warm every winter, which is a pledge related to support for vulnerable households, retrofitting of homes, and a transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And of course, it's you can find out more online, and again we will have a link in the report to their website as well. I'll just hand over to Laura now. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Next slide, please. So just final couple of minutes here now. So thank you everybody for coming and for your contributions to the group discussion there, the group chat and the questions. It's really good to see so many people interested and engaged in this piece of important research. So we've come to the end of the session. So I just wanted to say thanks again for being here and engaging with this event. Special thanks to Maya from National Energy Action for joining us and speaking so well. And a thank you to everybody who responded to our survey and to the focus group participants who made this piece of research happen. So thank you. Clearly fuel poverty is a problem across Greater Manchester, but hopefully this report will contribute to the growing calls for action, as it is clear that this can't continue. Next slide, please. So I'll just take a brief moment to highlight some further resources which may be of use in your work or of interest to you generally that are available on the GMPA website. We have produced a guide on the socio-economic duty, a briefing on why cash first approaches matter, and other welfare recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, we have the money advice referrals tools, which are live in 6 boroughs across Greater Manchester. We do also run the Greater Manchester Living Wage campaign, and we look after the Greater Manchester Poverty Monitor, and there's a lot more information about all of these things on our website. Thank you. Next slide, please. So there are ways that your organisation can support Greater Manchester Poverty Action and help us to continue doing work like this. We accept donations, and we would be pleased to extend our principal partner scheme, to any organisations that want to support us at an enhanced level. So if you would like any more info on this, please do get in contact again with one of us, and we can put you in touch with the right person. Next slide, please. You can also work with us. So we offer consultancy work across Greater Manchester and beyond, and we've worked with local authorities, the NHS and the combined authority to provide anti-poverty strategy development. We also provide training and programmes work, and we can assist with lived experience engagement too. Again, if you would be interested in any of this, please get in touch with us. Graham, our Chief Executive's details are on the screen there, but you can also get in touch with any of us here at GMPA. Next slide, please. So finally, just another big thank you from me and the team here at GMPA for attending this session and engaging with it. Please do share this report with your networks and on social media. It's also live on our website now. That's quite a long link to remember, but if you just go to the GMPA website, you'll see it there. And do please keep a lookout for our future policy outputs. So thanks so much, everyone, and it's been really good to see so many people here. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.